Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Custom Calculations. Your business is unique. Shouldn't your metrics be? This webinar is presented by Looker. My name is Elena, and I will be the host today. First, to start off, just a few housekeeping things. First off, this webinar will be recorded, so if you want to share it with anybody or come back later, no problem. Also, we will be posting the slides online. Second, there is a Q&A box in your console that you should see open, or if not, there's a button at the bottom that says Q&A that will allow you to ask questions throughout the presentation. They will be answering them at the end. Last up, we will be doing a live Looker demo at the end. If you're interested to stick around, we'll be doing questions first, so no pressure to stay around if you're not interested. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenters for today. First, we have Levi Davis, Professional Service Analyst at Looker.
Hi, everyone.
And also, we have Annika Kuster-Smith, a Pre-Sales Analyst at Looker.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us today.
And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Levi.
Thank you very much, Elena. Okay, so here's an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to be talking about moving beyond high-level KPIs. They certainly do have value, but I think alone they don't make a data-driven organization. Then we'll go on to talk about the benefits of custom metrics, how custom metrics can help you better gauge the efficacy of people, teams, and projects within your organization, and also how custom metrics can allow hunches to be tested, which is a valuable part of a data-driven culture. Then we'll talk about how to identify key metrics and roll them out to the entire organization. And the basic steps are to define what you want to measure, to creatively figure out what you want to measure, and then set up tracking if necessary, then take action and repeat. Okay, so moving beyond high-level KPIs. So first of all, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Exposure to high-level metrics, maybe on big TVs hung around the office, can be a very good thing. It can increase engagement with data. It helps unite an organization toward a common goal, and it can help propagate a data-driven culture, which I think, so this could be seen as one of the first steps to developing a data-driven culture. But we need to go beyond these high-level metrics. So profit is up, yay, right? But this looks good, but let's not quit and go home. So here are some reasons we need to move beyond these high metrics. So even if high-level metrics look good, there are probably opportunities hidden in the data. Digging deeper can uncover gems of insight, and of course, a process can always be improved. And I would say that dashboards alone do not make a data-driven company. Many business questions are ad hoc by nature and require custom metrics. And so it's very important that an organization has the tools that it needs so that non-technical people can quickly and easily ask at least simple questions of the data. The third thing is that most people can't move top-level metrics unless you're maybe part of the C-suite. Your impact on these high-level metrics might be too small to measure. And focusing just on these metrics that a lot of people can't move can be frustrating. And certainly tying incentives to these metrics can be demotivating. And now Annika will provide more detail about what happens when we move beyond high-level KPIs.
Thank you, Levi. So what happens when you dive deep? One of the key pieces to moving beyond standard KPIs and traditional dashboarding is to enable the consumers of the data to interact and ask questions on the fly. So when the entire organization can engage in ad hoc investigations, more of the decisions are being backed by data. More people are able to take part in those data-driven decisions, and a lot more interesting questions start being surfaced. So by enabling more people to answer their own questions, this also frees analysts to work on innovative analytics beyond routine reporting. So to kind of illustrate this point, I want to talk through an example of how a cable company was missing out on a major part of their potential customer base and how they remedied that. So Infectious Media is a British company that builds customized programmatic advertising campaigns. They're a customer of ours. And one of their clients is a major cable provider in the UK who wanted to better understand their customers' purchasing behavior. So the company, the cable company, had observed that women weren't purchasing cable connections, even though women made up about half of their viewers. So they conducted an in-depth study on demographic information, first purchase behavior, retention analytics, trying to understand how and why this was happening. So what did they find? It turned out that while men typically were making the initial cable connection purchase, which was almost always a premium sports packages, women came back 3 to 6 months after that initial purchase, ultimately making up most add-ons and the majority of their overall viewers. So by focusing on that initial purchase value and total signups, which might be the more traditional metrics to focus on, the cable company was essentially missing out on almost half of their potential customers. So following those findings, Infectious Media helped their client restructure their marketing engagement programs to target demographics they've been missing before. So now I'll pass us actually back to Levi, so you can talk about the benefits of custom analytics.
Thank you, Annika. So, who's the better employee here? It's kind of funny. I was actually working on this slide and looking for an image that I could use for the slide. And I looked over, and there was Jonathan and Ben looking exact like mirror images of each other. So thank you, Jonathan and Ben, for this image. So I think that every team member and projects deserve data-driven performance feedback. Feedback based solely on a manager's impression is often inaccurate and unfair. Performance incentives based on these high-level KPIs can also be demotivating if you really don't have the power to move them. And also, I would say that uncertainty about a project's impact can lead to some petty office politics. So this next story is about one of our clients called HubSpot. HubSpot is a marketing and sales organization. It looks like a really fun place to work to me. And these guys are a great example of taking performance incentives really to the next level. They use custom metrics to create an incentive structure for the sales team, which is nothing new. But what is new is that these metrics went beyond simply counting the number and size of deals, but actually made the quality and longevity of those deals. And the incentives that went with these metrics went beyond pay to actually include promotions, taking this process completely out of the hands of managers. And members of the sales team have constant real-time access to their performance metrics. And this is what it looks like. So every salesperson has their own personal dashboard, and this dashboard tells them attainment rate relative to their quota, which is pretty standard, but it also goes into detail on the install base of the deal, the number of months up front, and my favorite is actually the historical retention rate of their deals. And all of these metrics are rolled into an overall goals for the salespeople. And so what this does is that salespeople are now not just motivated to simply close as many deals as possible, but they're motivated to close deals that will not hurt other metrics, such as retention. So they have to close quality deals, not just a lot of them. And so these reports show where they currently are, how they got there, what they need to do to reach their goal, and also what they need to do in order to achieve the next promotion. And you can see that tile in the upper right-hand corner says either no or yes. And as soon as it says yes, that means you've achieved a promotion. How cool is that? So these promotions are automatically awarded in the dashboard. The salespeople will be the first people to find out about their promotions, and I think that's a really exciting way to work. Okay. Moving on to ad hoc analysis. So another important use for custom metrics is answering ad hoc questions. A data-driven business process is a series of quick ad hoc analysis. New metrics need to be invented all the time for each new situation. And it's imperative that at least simple questions should not have to be answered by an analyst. But I do feel that since I am an analyst, analysts should also be consulted before major data-driven business decisions to make sure that those conclusions are in fact solid. So as an example, we can imagine maybe an e-commerce website that is looking at sales by states, and someone from the mountain Midwest, which is where I'm from, Wyoming, might recognize that North Dakota seems to have an unusually high amount of revenue compared to its size. So a creative metric that could be created would be average profit per 100,000 of people in population. And so this is some very simple analysis that hopefully you would not need an analyst to do. And then of course this would require a lot more analysis to figure out exactly what's going on with North Dakota. So the great thing about everyone having access to the data is that everyone has these hunches, and it's good if you are able to test your hunches rather than having to engage an analyst and waiting for their backlog of requests to be filled. So one word of warning here is that there's a difference between testing hunches and just mining for correlations. If you do just start looking for relationships between variables and go through hundreds of variables, you are certainly going to fall on some spurious correlations or coincidental correlations. So Tyler Vegan has this great website all about spurious correlations, and he gives a lot of funny examples. But here's an example. If you dredge the data for correlations, you'll find something like that there's a strong correlation between people who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat and marriage rates in Kentucky. So it sounds absurd, but it's inevitable that if you start looking through a whole bunch of different variables, you're going to find some coincidental correlations. And so the rule of thumb here is that any analysis that you do needs to be repeatable on a new set of data. And that's kind of the basic idea behind statistical significance. I would also say that the results that you find need to be based on some kind of business logic. If you're getting a result that doesn't make sense, then you should figure out why it is doing what it's doing, and not just take it at face value. And then also, I would recommend that an analyst be consulted before making any major business decision based on data. Okay, and now I'll hand it over to Annika.
All right, thank you, Levi. So I actually want to talk through a story that'll illustrate a little bit about that here. So one of our analysts previously worked at a consulting firm. He was hired by a large sales organization, or the consulting firm was, to design a system that would detect expense fraud without having to review every single item. So the organization had historically been focused on who the biggest spenders were and how much they were spending and what the really big ticket items were. But fraud in those categories was actually pretty uncommon. The people who were expensing the most common, the most often, or the greatest dollar amounts were not necessarily the people committing fraud. So while the labor-intensive process of checking every single flight and hotel booking was costing actually kind of a lot of money, it was saving very little. So given the details of that expense policy handed to the consultants, they thought up a number of ways that somebody might try to cheat the system. So after some extensive testing, testing out different possible predictors of fraud, it turned out that the best predictor was not the total amount that an individual expensed, but the number of expenses by that individual. So based on that data, the company implemented a smart audit, and it used a weighted score. So that included things like the number of meals expensed per day. Remarkably, people were expensing 11, 12 meals a day, some of them for 20 cents, adding up to exactly their daily limit. Cell phone bills per year. Most of us have 12, presumably, but there were people who mysteriously had 36 or 48. And finally, gratuity percentage. You can kind of imagine people getting creative with the tipping there. So this score flagged risky individuals. This warranted a manual review of their expenses. So if somebody came up pretty high on this score for seeming to have an awful lot of meals and cell phone bills per year, certainly there might be cases where somebody's really hungry. There might be cases where that's expected, but with a manual review, they could go through and figure out if there might be some fraud being committed there. So armed with those no predictors, they actually reduced the amount of work that was going into detecting fraud and shaved off 3 to 5% of their annual expense bill of tens of millions of dollars. All right, so moving to our next section, how do we actually identify those key metrics? So kind of the first piece is to define what you actually want to drive or what you want to understand. So this might be increased referrals, higher spend, retention over time, and that'll really vary across teams within an organization, across the individuals, for the entire business, and can be really very specific. So how do we measure that? Part two is kind of how are we going to quantify whatever we're trying to drive or understand? We may already have systems in place to track this, or we may not. New technologies may need to get involved, new tracking, new systems. And in some cases, this will get pretty creative, so we'll have a little bit more on that later. Finally, take action. So once we put those systems into place, we have to keep evaluating what's working, what's not working. How can we adjust our operations to actually drive the behavior we want to see? And from there, we want to monitor the new systems and the new metrics that we're using, making sure that they weren't just coincidental, that we actually do mean something, and that over time, they're continuing to be iterated upon and that they mean something. So it's a little more detail on how we go into defining, quantifying, and taking action. Back to Levi.
Thank you, Annika. Okay, so creativity. Creativity is key because it's often difficult or impossible to directly measure the metric that you're interested in. So for example, it's probably pretty hard to measure how happy your customers are with your product. But what we can do, one thing we can do is look for a proxy variable or a covariate to the metric that we're actually interested in measuring. So if you want to measure happiness, but you can't directly measure it, you might be able to measure social media shares and likes. You might be able to measure customer engagement with the product. You might be able to do some text analysis for positive or negative words. Or you could imagine if you can't measure happiness, you could measure the opposite. You could try to measure unhappiness. And so it makes sense that if you can decrease unhappiness, you probably are increasing happiness. Next. It's often necessary to set up tracking for the custom metric that you want. Setting up tracking needs to be kind of a quick and easy and constant process because there are always going to be new things that you want to track, and it needs to be fairly quick and easy to set up tracking. So one example of this came from actually our professional services team, which one of the main things that we do is we deliver trainings to our clients on the use of our product. And for a long time, all of these analysts or consultants were delivering trainings without really knowing the impact of those trainings. Of course, we can look at stuff like engagement pre and post, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. So what we did was we set up a test, or sorry, not a test, it's a quiz, a very short quiz, about 14 questions long. that is designed to measure the key concepts associated with using our product. And we found a lot of useful things. So for example, we found that we probably were not focusing on the key concepts behind using our product enough, and we were focusing too much on stuff like how to save your work and how to share your work, which is just simply using software, which most people can pick up pretty quickly and easily. So we set up this test, this quiz. We then loaded the results into Looker, and then the results were in Looker so that we could look at the results of the test by trainer, by client, by topic area. And we found a lot of insights in this data. Another example is we found that we probably weren't spending enough time teaching filtering. And so we were able to beef up our training in filtering, and we were able to bring up those test scores. And since we started optimizing our training using this kind of quiz, we have actually seen a jump in customer engagement with the product. And this could only happen with kind of creatively coming up with a metric to measure what you want to measure, and then setting up tracking. Okay, now data democracy. So I know it's kind of a common question among analysts is do you teach SQL to non-technical people? And the argument for this is that if all of your data is pulled using SQL, and there are only a limited number of analysts to pull data, then that means there's inevitably going to be a backlog of data pull requests. So if you can give non-technical people access to SQL and maybe give them some example queries, then people can pull their own data, and this would take some of the stress off of the analyst. Of course, the problem with this is that if a person is not an analyst and they're not really familiar with SQL, it might be easy for them to make a mistake and come to wrong conclusions. And that would be the argument against giving everyone in an organization access to SQL. So, but what I would say is that it's not either or. This is there is a third way, and that is if you have a good BI tool that allows non-technical people to answer at least basic questions of the data, then this takes a huge, a lot of stress off of the analyst, and also it gives people the power to answer these questions themselves. And one of our founders, Ben Porterfield, said, becoming a data-driven will never happen in your company until people who don't know SQL can ask questions on their own. And I agree with that. Okay, and here I'm handing it off to Annika.
Thanks, Levi. So how do you measure success? I want to talk about a story for one of our customers, how they kind of rethought their entire system of how they wanted to track the success of their company, the success of their projects, and how that really changed their organization. So a lot of you probably heard of Upworthy. They're a media company. They're focused on sharing progressive news and stories that their readers will consider really meaty. They strive to create stories that'll go viral and that sort of have a cause to them or have some meaning. It will be kind of feel good or really profound. So they started out initially using pretty traditional accepted metrics. They were looking just mostly at page views. Like many organizations, they knew how many people had clicked on or even shared an article, but this didn't necessarily tell them how much that reader engaged with and enjoyed the content. So they weren't really knowing necessarily how this was matching their goal of, was this sensational, was this substantial? Is this something that made you feel good after you read it? So to more directly address their goals of providing meaningful and fulfilling content, they thought about how they could change the measure of success. Daniel Mintz had a quote in the blog here, 20 page views, 0 user satisfaction. Probably familiar for those of us who've been stuck in the slideshow trap. So let's identify their new key metrics. So first, they defined that they wanted to determine what would maximize attention for meaningful content. So that's what they really wanted to optimize for and to track. So they quantified it. They came up with a metric called attention minutes. So they installed tracking on their site that would allow them to see whether people were moving their mouse around on the page, if they were staying engaged, if they were actually actively engaging with what was there. So that created two really key metrics that they started to zero in on. The first is total attention on site, and that's taken over a given time frame, whether that's an hour or a week. And this tells them how well the company is doing overall at drawing attention to important topics. So kind of the way a lot of companies might look at revenue or something is, are we doing well? Are we successful? The second was total attention for a piece. So this is about how many people open something and how much of it they actually engage with. So pieces with higher total attention should be promoted more, and they probably want to curate more content that's like that piece. This is something that people are engaging with, and it's actually matching their higher level goals. So acting and refining, they put into place this new system, just changing how they were tracking, actually changed the way they were curating. So they refined their processes, they analyzed page views, they compared this to how it measured up with attention minutes. You'll see in this chart, there's actually kind of a frightening difference, sort of lack of correlation between those, between the metrics. And they consider what type of content actually merits promotion. So what makes a catchy headline, something about explicit television, may not be what people actually want to engage with. So they continue to iterate over this over time. How did that work out for them? Pretty successfully. They saw really big growth in the metric they were hoping to actually drive, which mapped a lot more closely to what their actual goals were. And by promoting, curating content that engaged their readers, they saw they started that they really outperformed their goals. Just a quick note, if you actually want to read the blog that Daniel Mintz, the head of analytics over at Upworthy, wrote about this process, it's available on our blog as well as theirs, and it's really worth checking out. So before we leave you guys today, I just wanted to highlight a couple main points. If you're trying to gain more understanding and more control over your business, it's really important to ask if you're using the right metrics, like not what you think other companies in your space are using, but really match to what your goal is. And then you ask if the right people are being given access to those metrics. You can think about how you can create KPIs that represent what you really want to accomplish, and then how your team members, how your projects, how your individuals in your business can actually work towards the broader success of the company. All right, so with that, I'd like to open up for any questions. Let's see if we had any come in here. I see one asking, let's see, how are you doing this at Looker? So how are you using custom metrics? Levi, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So another way that we use custom metrics at Looker is that I think the example I would use would be our customer health metric. So we monitor use of our product, and we monitor things like both use by technical people in building and reinforcing the existing model, and use by the end users in querying the data and looking at dashboards and creating dashboards and things like that. And we use this, it's a pretty complex combination of different metrics, but what we end up with is a metric that really gives us an idea of maybe which clients are kind of having a hard time with the product, or who aren't using it very much, and then we can use that to identify which of our clients could use some extra help, maybe some extra training, or just some technical help, or whatever we think is needed. So that's a very important metric that we use here at Looker.
Great. That is the end of our questions for today. Thank you so much, Levi and Annika. As I mentioned at the beginning, this recording will be available on looker.com tomorrow, along with the slides from it. So if any of your coworkers were unable to make this morning's session, we will be able to send it to them. And additionally, Annika will be giving a brief demo of Looker for those of you who are interested. If not, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you, and we hope that you learned a little something. All right, off to you, Annika.
All right, thank you. And if you have any more questions that you wanted to share, feel free to send them right into the box, and we can get back to them after the demo. So let's get going here. Let me figure out how to share my screen. So Looker is a web application. I'm in here actually just using Firefox to look at Looker. And I've logged in. Essentially, when we connect to somebody's database, we'll go through, we'll run a generator. It'll represent what's there and make it easy for somebody to ask questions based off of the columns and the metrics that are available already. And then the role of the analyst is to go in and really customize that. So to bring out the types of metrics that will be important. So whatever key metrics you've kind of defined and decided that you want to track and have loaded into your database, creating logic around them. So it doesn't necessarily have to be as a part of your ETL process. This can also be something that you're doing within the modeling layer in Looker. So this data set that we're working with is based off of the website for an e-commerce business. So they'll have information about transactions that occur, about the users who've logged in, but then they're also tracking types of things, in this case, page views. But if I were Upworthy, perhaps I'd be tracking attention minutes or things that map more closely to what my business goals are. All right, so in this case, somebody's gone through, defined the metrics, done sort of the analytical work to get this all in place on behalf of their users. So we can look at things like how long are people spending on the website overall, which would kind of be an example of more of a high-level metric. But then considering things that might be interesting for a website design team. How much are people bouncing if their entry is to a given page on the site? How many people are viewing that page? So for instance, our bounce rate's relatively low on department apparel. We're actually having kind of a higher bounce rate and a lot of visitors to fan shop. So maybe this is a page that we can improve and iterate on to actually improve the user experience. Looking at how this is cohorted by a landing page as well as bounce rate page. A lot of our customers like to look through funnels, split these out in a number of different ways. So if I go in here as an example, is that coming through okay? Great. All right, so we can split this out. If I want to look, for example, at the source that my user originally came from, I'll add this metric, run on it, and we'll see this update here. So now we're looking at, for organic versus email versus search, Facebook display, are people interacting a little bit differently? Now, if I want to keep exploring this, for example, I want to see, instead of just the number of sessions, I actually want to see the number of distinct users. So I'll add this additional measure in to see where they're coming from and what step they're actually getting to in this funnel. And if I want to see who those 6,000 people who came in through display were, I can drill in and take a look at a list of metrics about those specific users. So the drill path that you see here is something that you'll define when you're setting up your model, or that your analyst will define. So whether that's user ID, name, email, if you've set something up like the nice lifetime number of orders that a user's placed, or something along those sort of slightly more detailed lines, then that's what would get configured into the model, so that when the users interact, they'll have a truly sort of customized experience with the application. All right, going back to our dashboard here. One thing I always love to show, by nature of being a web-based application, we can embed little bits of HTML. So I can grab this value here, Quicksilver, feed it into the filter of an additional dashboard that I've set up, and use this as kind of a lookup of, use it a lookup for that specific brand. So here now I'm seeing how many orders were actually placed. This is coming from our transactional data set. How many customers have purchased it? And this is just for the past 90 days. Now, if I want to filter on that, I can change this to say 30 days, for example, and rerun my dashboard. And we'll see that each of these elements is updating. And this will be reflecting in real time what's in our database. So we're making that live connection. And it means that if your ETL is up to the minute, or if you're connecting to a read replica that has that's really close to real time, you can actually do alerting and analytics that are hourly or up to the minute. So let me actually go in and walk through how I would create an exploration from scratch. So I'm going to start out just in this order items view. So the first thing I want to see is just over all of time, how many order items have there been? For those of you familiar with SQL, I'll be flashing back and forth to the SQL tab here. So we can kind of see what exactly is getting generated on behalf of the user by Looker. So in this case, we're seeing count star. We can see how this count was actually defined on this order items table. It's just measure count, type count, and then informing which specific fields we want to see when we drill in. So now I want to see this split out by day. So let's look at the orders created date, and let's look at this just for the past 30 days. So we're still on the SQL tab. We can see the time zone conversion that's occurring here. We can see that it's using a date function. If I put in months or weeks or years, we can see how slightly different transformations will be done at query time. And the reason we like to do this at query time is to keep things as close to real time as possible, so that you're not having to wait for those changes to be made to the data types. All right, so let's start to visualize what we have here. We're just looking at orders by date, total number of order items. This makes a nice line chart, column, bar, scatter, area, really whatever we want to use here. I'll stick to a column because that's my favorite. So now if I want to look at this by some other attributes, for example, if I wanted to look at this by the category that the item is in, I'll add a pivot so that I'll put the values of category name across the top here. And I just want to look at a few of our categories. I don't necessarily need to look at all of them. So I'll look at accessories, socks, suits, and swimwear. So I'll run that. Now we'll get this chart. We'll see accessories has its own column, socks has its own column. And each of these is appearing as its own series on the chart. So this looks, I mean, really a little messy, so let's customize it. So first I want to stack these guys on top of each other. Perhaps I want to change this to a time axis so that when I change the time I'm looking at, it'll scale nicely. I can add value labels on here if I'd like. I can also adjust the colors. So if I want this red, orange, yellow, green, it's going to look terrible, but we can use those HTML colors to customize how we want this to look. A lot of times if people are using Looker operationally to track order status or something along those lines, it might make sense to call out the specific order status that you want to see here. So if I swap out, for example, if I want to show pending and active and finished orders in slightly different states, rather than doing chart colors up here, I can actually call them out and say, I want canceled to be red. I want complete. Let me go on to the next line here. Complete should be green. And I actually like pending to be light blue. So if you have hex values you want to use here, that's perfectly fine as well. Might look good as a staff percentage. Anyway, there's quite a lot I can do to customize this to look as pretty as I want it to look. So maybe I'll take this and add it to a dashboard now. So I'll save my report, orders by status, and I'll just save this into my own personal workspace. All right, so now I want to add this to a dashboard. I'm going to add it to an existing dashboard I have, just a simple sales summary. And let's go take a look at that dashboard right now. I have a few different funny things on here, leads by status from some Salesforce data. I'm actually just going to remove that because I don't think it's interesting right now. I can drag things around on here to change the order that they'll appear in, change the relative heights. We're actually releasing a brand new layout pretty soon for these dashboards, so get excited for that. Now, if I want to configure the filters that I have on here, right now I have a date filter, so I'll tell my orders by status to actually obey that filter and say orders created date. And maybe let's add another filter actually. Let's add the state that the user was in. So I'm going to have Looker suggest for me on here. I'm just going to look from the look. I'm going to look from our order items explorer because that's where I base that query from. And then the field that I want these suggestions to populate from would be user state. And I'll leave my default value blank. So now I'm going to tell, it looks like I actually lost this one I didn't save earlier. Let's add state to each of these elements so that they'll actually obey it. All right, and save. Refresh this dashboard to update with our new changes, and then we can start to interact with it. So if I want to now look, instead of 30 days, let's just look at 20 days. And I only want to look at California, New York, and Texas. So I'll rerun my dashboard. And just like the dashboard we saw right at the beginning, this will run in real time. Now, if I'm looking at this, maybe I'm a member of the operations team and I'm saying, well, you know, gosh, we have an awful lot of pending orders from almost 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to click on these guys. Once again, using that drill path to go in and understand what's underlying the data that I'm looking at. Who are these users? If I need to contact them, maybe I'll add their emails to this report and then download this to share it with other members of my team who might be able to help me get these orders kind of up and going at the rate that we expect them to be. All right, so I'm going to click back a few times to go back to my dashboard. Pretty easy to navigate around here. So if I want to download this dashboard and share it, I can do so just as a simple PDF. I can also schedule this out. So if I want on a daily, weekly, hourly, monthly basis to be sending this email, let's see, maybe at 8 a.m., it looks like my Firefox is crowding things just a little bit. I can send this inline. I can send this as a PDF attachment. And this email can go out to people who have Looker logins, people who don't have Looker logins. So if I have board members or if I have you know, people working on a packing floor who need to receive these reports, I can send them out. And I just list these email addresses here. If the user does have a Looker login, they'll receive a link so that they can log back in and see what, interact with that data, drill into it, and actually find out what's going on. I always like to show a little how we can share some of these results publicly, so with iframes and with Excel and Google Spreadsheets. So let me go back into my orders by status report here, and I'll edit it. And I'll enable public access. So what that does is it creates this hashed URL right here. So if I hand this to somebody, if I were to send this out to all of you right now, you'd have, as long as I leave this public access box checked, access to look at the result set for this single query. So if I take this visualization, and let me actually strip some of the wrappers off of here. There we go. Then I can just look at orders by status. I can interact with this. And this is something I can share with anybody. They don't have to have a Looker login to play with this. Going back to here. Now, if I want to do this with Google Spreadsheets, I can open up a new spreadsheet. I'll paste in the import XML function that Looker generated for me. It uses that same URL, you're seeing that there, and it's just loading in that result set. So if I come back to this a month from now, it's going to have the most recent 30 days with all the most recent results. So if you need to share this with people who don't necessarily have to come in and slice and dice the data and drill into it, you can still give them this output that'll let them look at some data that they need to work with. And this works as well with Excel, just uses a web query file, and the import is just a little bit different. All right, so I'm going to jump on into the LookML and just give you a really quick high-level overview of what our modeling layer is all about. So when we first connect to the database, I think I talked to this just a little bit earlier, we'll run the generator. And the generator finds, okay, there's an inventory items table, there's an order items table, orders, products, users, and so forth. And the simple representation of that table is available right off the bat. So something like looking at the ID and the inventory item ID and whether that item was returned and what the sale price was, that's all fairly basic. So where the customization of Looker comes into play is when we're defining, in this case, fairly simple gross margin. We're just subtracting values from two different tables and referencing the definitions of them within our model so that we can keep recycling them. So for instance, when I define gross margin here, I can use that same definition once again when I want to look at item gross margin percentage, or if I want to take this percentage and turn it into a tier, so basically create buckets out of that value. I can do the same thing when I want to start aggregating. So I've taken gross margin and I wanted to do a sum of gross margin. So I'll just use type sum. This is analogous, or actually just generates the Looker, the sum function in the SQL itself. And then I'm also telling it exactly how I want it to render. I want it to use this value format. I want this many decimals. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like when I generate it. If I go back to my order items table and I select gross margin, we can see gross margin, lo and behold, is just sale price minus inventory items cost. Now, if I want to add total gross margin, we'll see this is actually taking the sum of order items minus inventory items cost and doing a coalesce just to handle nulls nicely for a sum. So we can see exactly how the little building blocks and snippets that we create within this model will then turn around and generate exactly how the user interacts with the application. So one of the tools that we use quite a lot for more advanced types of analysis is something called derived tables. So that lets you write a little snippet of SQL and create either a temp table in MySQL, a with clause in Postgres, or Redshift, or actually write to a writable Scratch schema. So if Looker's given access to write to a specific schema on the database, it can persist these tables, query them, and this can be really helpful for performance and also for putting complex transformations into the hands of the analyst without necessarily needing to go through the ETL process or going back to the IT team. Just to look at kind of an example of what one might do there. If you wanted to cohort first order behavior, this is something I see quite a lot when people are trying to understand their product. So I'll see this with product teams quite often. They'll look at when was the first order date. They might look at, trying to think what a good example in here might be. They might look at the total number of first orders. This is a fairly simple table. Or in the case of users order facts, they might want to see when was their latest order, how many days has this person been a customer. In their case, this business considers a customer, someone to be a customer after they've actually created an order. How many days since their last purchase. And then these are the types of things that we can start to cohort on. So I can say, is somebody a repeat customer, yes or no? What I could also create a concept of what a power user means to me. So let's create a little dimension. Is power user, type yes, no. And the way I'll define this SQL here, oh man, never type live, is I want to see whether or not this user has had a lifetime number of orders that's greater than 5. So I'll save that. And let's go back to this Explore that we were looking at before. And I'm just going to refresh the page to bring in the new changes I made to the model. All right, so let's clear this out. Let's add in is power user. So now I want to see how our power users are actually comparing for the amount of money they're bringing in for our business. So let's look at the average lifetime value. Well, that's kind of an obvious answer. Let's look at the total. Let's look at the total gross margin that we're getting from people who are and aren't power users, and let's just look at this over time. Over 12 months, for example, and run that. So right now what this is doing for us is it's considering the that order facts table that we generated. It's, let's see if this guy's persisted. It is indeed, but it may not have been run quite yet today. So it'll be generating this, this table for us, writing it into a temporary schema. So now for 12 hours, this will be available for us to use. All right. But anyhow, so that's kind of where I would go in and define a definition that means something to me. Obviously, power user might be something completely different in a different business. We can see the amount of money that's coming in for people who aren't our power users. Stack this up, and we're seeing that our power users, even though there's probably relatively few of them, and we can look at how many of them there actually are, make up a big chunk of the amount of revenue that we're producing. So people who keep coming back to us are really valuable. So maybe we want to reward those people. Anyhow, that kind of concludes what I wanted to take you all through in the demo today. Let's turn this over to questions. I'm going to stop my screen share here.
So the first question we have is from Tyler Ferguson. So his question is, an important metric for us are trend lines. Is this sort of custom calculation available in Looker?
Hi, Tyler. This is Levi. So we don't have an out-of-the-box trend line feature in Looker. It is possible to do it, however. I wrote an article on how to do this, and it does require that you actually input the equations for a least squared regression. So there is some stats that you can do in Looker, but for the most part, I think I would recommend that what Looker makes really easy is writing complex SQL to pull a data set that you might want to use for some more advanced analytics. And so what we often recommend is that people in Looker write the query of their database to extract data they want, and then just download it as a CSV so that you can put it in the stats package of your choice. But I know that basic stats functions like this are actually on the product roadmap, and I think that we will have this functionality fairly soon.
Great, thank you, Levi. Next question we have is, how does the data set get loaded into this instance of Looker? Manual upload, API, automated feed, etc.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so we don't actually load the data into Looker itself. So Looker, we don't host data, we don't hold your data. We actually connect to your existing data warehouse. So that increases security. A lot of our customers will actually choose to host completely on-premise so that we're not holding their data for them. So we'll use JDBC to connect. So whether you're in Redshift or Postgres or BigQuery or whatever database you might have your data in, Looker will connect to it and run those queries actually in your database. So in this case, the data set that I was working with was just a fictional generated data set, kind of from fictional log files, but those events that one could track could come from anything. I mean, that could come from Google Analytics, it could come from Segment, Snowplow. We have a number of partners who do event collection and tracking. And then the transformations that you do on top of that. So building out the modeling layer, defining how you want to think about a session, how you want to think about a power user, that kind of thing. That's the customization that happens by your analysts in the modeling layer.
Great, thank you, Annika. The last question we have for today is, what is the best way to define average LTV? I think this question is really interesting because it seems like something that would just be so custom to every business. Like, because every business is different, like every LTV I can imagine would be different. I'm going to pass this off to Levi to maybe give some best practices.
Yeah, so that is how to define average LTV. That's a pretty complicated question. But I think how I've approached this in the past is to cohort people based on how they came to your business, and maybe when they came to your business, and then follow them for a set amount of time. So maybe 3 months or something like that, or half a year, and get the average revenue from those people during that time. But I think this is a pretty big question. But I think we have at Looker written quite a few articles about LTV and the different ways of doing it. And so if you Google Looker and LTV, you're probably going to find some of the articles that we've written about this.
Great. So there are some other questions coming in, but we are unfortunately all out of time. We will be answering your questions directly, so no need to worry, they will get answered. But thank you again, everybody, so much for coming. I'll be sending out an email later tomorrow with the recorded version of this webinar, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.